Somewhere in the American Midwest, sometime around 1950, a farmer made a decision that his grandfather would not have recognized as farming at all. He ordered a truck delivery of nitrogen fertilizer, paid for it, spread it across his fields, and watched his crops grow the same way they always had. His grandfather had grown the same crops on the same land without ever ordering a delivery of anything. He had grown a plant instead. That plant pulled nitrogen directly from the atmosphere. It fixed it into the soil. It grew 6 tons of biomass in 60 days without a single external input. And when the following season arrived, the soil it left behind was richer than the soil it had found. His grandfather called this farming. The fertilizer company that arrived in the middle of the 20th century called it inefficient and offered a truck with a bag as the modern alternative. His grandfather's farm had been productive for 3 generations before that truck arrived. The farm that replaced it with synthetic nitrogen has been structurally dependent on that truck ever since. The plant is still growing wild in fields across North America. The knowledge of how to use it has been sitting in agricultural science journals for decades, in extension bulletins, in the hands of every certified organic farmer who has ever managed a rotation. And most gardeners and small farmers alive today have never once been taught the system that made their great-grandparents independent of every input that now arrives on a truck from a company they cannot negotiate with. We open the file on nitrogen-fixing crops, the biological system that fed human civilizations for thousands of years without a single bag of fertilizer, and the commercial infrastructure that replaced it in 1 generation, while most of the people doing the farming never understood what they were giving up. 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen. Every cubic meter of air above a farmer's field contains thousands of times more nitrogen than any commercial fertilizer application could deliver in a single season. The problem is not that nitrogen is scarce. The problem is that atmospheric nitrogen is locked in a molecular form that plants cannot access. Nitrogen gas consists of 2 nitrogen atoms bonded together with a triple bond, one of the strongest bonds in chemistry. Breaking that bond to release nitrogen into a form that plant roots can absorb requires either an enormous amount of industrial energy. The Haber-Bosch process, which underpins the global synthetic fertilizer industry, runs at temperatures approaching 500 degrees Celsius and pressures dozens of times higher than atmospheric. Or a living organism that has evolved the biological machinery to do the same thing at room temperature in the soil. Those organisms exist. They have been in the soil for millions of years. And they do their best work in a specific relationship with a specific category of plants. Legumes, the plant family that includes alfalfa, clover, beans, peas, lentils, vetch, and dozens of other species across nearly every agricultural tradition on Earth, host colonies of bacteria called rhizobium and nodules on their root systems. These bacteria carry an enzyme called nitrogenase, one of the most energetically remarkable biological tools in the living world, capable of breaking that triple nitrogen bond and converting atmospheric nitrogen into ammonium. The form plant roots absorb and use to build protein, chlorophyll, and every nitrogen-containing compound in plant tissue. The legume feeds the bacteria sugar produced through photosynthesis, delivered through the root. The bacteria converts atmospheric nitrogen into plant-available fertilizer in return. Neither organism can do this alone. Together, they run a biological nitrogen factory in the soil that requires no industrial input. No delivery truck, no quarterly invoice, and no negotiation with a supplier whose price is set by markets a farmer cannot influence. This relationship is ancient. It is not a new discovery. Biologists have understood the basic mechanism for well over a century. And the evolutionary relationship between legumes and nitrogen-fixing bacteria predates human agriculture by millions of years. The bacteria were fixing nitrogen long before there were farmers to benefit from it. The legumes were partnering with them long before anyone understood why legume fields produced better crops the following year. The system did not need human understanding to work. It worked regardless of whether anyone knew the word nitrogenase, and it would continue working regardless of whether the synthetic fertilizer industry existed at all. Stay with me, because what this system produces is the part that the fertilizer industry needs you not to calculate too carefully. A well-managed stand of alfalfa, the leguminous crop historically most widely used for soil building in North American farming, fixes between 200 and 300 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year under favorable growing conditions. According to extension research from the University of Minnesota and similar institutions across the Corn Belt, high-performing stands under optimal management have been documented fixing over 400 pounds per acre in a single season, a figure that the synthetic fertilizer industry would need to sell you multiple applications to match. For context, a typical cornfield in the United States receives between 100 and 200 pounds of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer per acre per season, representing one of the largest single input costs in American agriculture, costing somewhere between $50 and $200 per acre depending on market prices in any given year. Alfalfa delivers comparable or greater nitrogen than that synthetic application for free. while simultaneously growing 6 tons of biomass per acre across multiple cuttings in a single 60-day cutting cycle. Biomass that can be grazed in place by livestock, cut for hay, and sold as a cash crop, or incorporated into the soil as green manure for the following season's cash crop. It does this while building soil organic matter with each cutting and each root turnover, suppressing certain weeds through its dense canopy and allelopathic root exudates, and improving the physical structure of soil through its deep taproot, which can extend 15 feet or more into the ground, breaking up compacted layers that tillage equipment damages but cannot penetrate to the same depth. A field managed under alfalfa rotation for 3 years emerges from that rotation with measurably higher organic matter, more active soil biology, and better physical structure than it entered with. A field managed under continuous corn with synthetic nitrogen inputs over the same 3 years generally shows the opposite trend. These numbers are not radical or contested claims from organic farming advocates. They are standard extension service findings available on the websites of land-grant universities across the country. The information exists. It has always existed. It is simply not what anyone with a product to sell has a financial interest in making sure you see. Ancient farmers did not know the word rhizobium. They did not know about nitrogenase or atmospheric nitrogen fixation or the molecular structure of the triple bond they were circumventing. What they knew was simpler, more direct, and more reliable than any of that terminology. They knew that the field where legumes had grown produced better crops the following year. They knew that land rested under clover or vetch or beans recovered its productivity in a way that bare fallow never quite matched. They knew that the rotation mattered, that the sequence of crops across years was as important to long-term output as any single season's management decision. And they knew it, not because they had read a study. They knew it because 3 generations of farmers before them had observed it and passed the observation down. The Romans practiced systematic legume rotation for grain fields, embedding it in agricultural texts that have survived 2,000 years. Columella, the Roman agricultural writer of the 1st century, described the practice of alternating grain with legume crops explicitly, noting the improvement in subsequent grain yields that the legume season produced. Medieval European farmers embedded nitrogen fixation into the 3-field system, dividing their land into sections growing grain, legume crops, and fallow in rotation. A system sophisticated enough in its understanding of soil dynamics that it sustained European agriculture for centuries of continuous cultivation. Asian rice farmers grew green manure, legume crops, in flooded paddies between rice seasons, exploiting the same biological mechanism through a completely different cultural tradition that arrived at the same practical answer independently. Indigenous American farmers intercropped beans, the legume of the 3 sisters, with corn and squash, specifically because they understood through direct multi-generational observation that the combination produced better yields than corn grown alone, year after year on the same ground. These were not traditions preserved out of sentiment or spiritual significance, though they acquired both over time. They were functional systems, refined across centuries of practical trial, that maintained soil fertility across generations of continuous cultivation without external inputs of any kind. They worked because nitrogen fixation works, and they worked without a dollar spent, a truck ordered, or a company consulted. Here is where the vault opens on something that should change how you think about the way modern agriculture is structured. The Haber-Bosch process, developed by Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch in Germany in the early 20th century, and scaled into industrial production through the decades that followed, solved the nitrogen problem through industrial chemistry. It produced synthetic nitrogen fertilizer at a scale that made it commercially viable as a global commodity, priced competitively enough to reach farmers who had previously been entirely self-sufficient in their nitrogen supply. The agriculture that followed the Second World War was largely built around the availability of cheap, abundant synthetic nitrogen. Fields that had previously required legume rotations to maintain fertility could now receive their nitrogen from a bag. And the legume rotation, which had occupied a portion of every productive farm field for millennia, began to shrink as farmers converted that acreage to the cash crops that synthetic nitrogen could now support year after year on the same ground. This was not a conspiracy. Synthetic nitrogen genuinely produced higher short-term yields on depleted soil. The green revolution that fed the expanding global population in the second half of the 20th century depended on it, and the human lives extended and saved by that food production are real. The fertilizer companies were not lying when they said their products worked. They worked exactly as described, delivering nitrogen to crops at rates that produced yields the old rotational systems could not immediately match, on a field-by-field, season-by-season comparison. What they did not advertise was what was being lost in the transition. Because what was being lost was not visible in a single season's yield data and was not reflected in the price of the fertilizer bag. Soil organic matter, built over generations of legume rotation and organic material incorporation, began declining on fields, shifted to continuous synthetic nitrogen use. The microbial communities that made soil biology function, communities shaped by and dependent on the organic inputs that legume systems provided, declined alongside the organic matter they depended on. The structural fertility that an ancient farming system had taken generations to build began to dissipate within decades of the rotation being abandoned, and the economic independence that came from a farming system producing its own fertility was replaced by a structural dependence on an input supply chain that a farmer cannot control, cannot produce, and must purchase at whatever price the fertilizer market sets in any given season. That dependence is now so deeply embedded in most commercial agriculture that it is no longer visible as a choice. It is simply how farming works. The rotation that eliminated the need for the truck was replaced by a truck, and the knowledge of the rotation faded from practice within a generation that had more profitable things to do with the acreage. Alfalfa is still grown widely across the American West and Midwest. It has not disappeared, but it is grown today primarily as a hay crop and animal feed commodity, valued for its protein content and palatability to cattle and horses, not as the soil-building rotation tool it served as for most of its cultivated history. The fertility-building function and the forage function were never in conflict. Farmers who grew it historically understood both simultaneously. What changed was the framing, and the framing changed because synthetic nitrogen made the fertility-building function seem commercially optional to an industry that had a truck to sell instead. Here's how to bring nitrogen fixation back into a home garden or small farm operation, and why even a small-scale application of this system matters more than most gardening guides suggest. The simplest entry point is cover cropping. At the end of a growing season, before the ground freezes or before your climate's dry season begins, sow a legume cover crop over your empty garden beds or between annual planting cycles. Crimson clover is one of the most widely available and reliable options for home gardens, germinating quickly, fixing nitrogen actively through fall and early spring in most climates, and producing a dense above-ground mass that, when terminated and incorporated, releases its fixed nitrogen to the following crop over several weeks. Hairy vetch fixes nitrogen in higher volumes than most other cover crop legumes and performs well in cold climates where crimson clover struggles. Field peas terminated in early spring before they flower provide nitrogen fixation combined with a loose, carbon-rich biomass that incorporates easily without equipment. Any of these, seeded at the end of the growing season and terminated 3 to 4 weeks before the next planting, will deliver measurable nitrogen to the following crop at no cost beyond the price of seed. For larger operations, the traditional 3-year rotation of one season of a nitrogen-demanding crop like corn or tomatoes, followed by one season of a moderate-demand crop, followed by one season of legume hay or cover crop, mirrors the system that European farmers refined across centuries of practice. Each full rotation cycle leaves the soil with measurably more organic matter, better biological activity, and higher nitrogen levels than continuous cropping on synthetic inputs could achieve over the same period without the biological component. There's one detail that makes the difference between a cover crop that fixes nitrogen effectively and one that does not. The bacteria required for nitrogen fixation, rhizobium and its relatives, must be present in the soil to colonize the legume's roots and form the nodules where fixation occurs. In healthy, biologically active soil with a history of legume cultivation, these bacteria are typically already present. In heavily disturbed soil, soil that has been fumigated, soil with no history of legume growth, or soil with very low organic matter, the native bacterial populations may be insufficient to colonize roots effectively. The solution is inoculant, a small package of the correct rhizobium species applied to the seed at planting. Available from any agricultural seed supplier for a few dollars and sufficient to treat far more seed than a home gardener would use in a season. Well-inoculated legumes develop visible pink nodules on their roots within weeks of germination, a color produced by legumoglobin, the same oxygen-carrying molecule found in animal blood, which the bacteria use to manage oxygen levels inside the nodule. Pink, active nodules mean nitrogen fixation is happening. White or brown nodules, or no nodules at all, mean it is not. Your great-grandfather knew the name of the crop that fed his soil between cash crop seasons. He knew how long to grow it and when to turn it in. He knew that the rotation was not a choice to be made in good years when he could afford to take a field out of cash crop production. It was the foundation of production, the thing that made the cash crop possible. The system that had no truck, no delivery, no price set by a company in another state. The truck arrived. The rotation ended. The soil that took generations to build began to degrade in decades. And the knowledge of what built it in the first place became the kind of thing kept only in agricultural history texts and certified organic grower guides, invisible to the mainstream of a farming industry that now depends entirely on the truck continuing to arrive. The biology that made the rotation work is still in the ground. The bacteria are still there in any soil that has not been completely stripped of its biological community. The seeds are still cheap, The system still works exactly the way it worked when Columella described it in Latin in the 1st century CE. And when the three sisters were being planted in the same fields for the 100th consecutive generation without a bag of anything arriving from outside the farm, if this vault opens something for you, subscribe and hit the bell. Every like and every share preserves what they tried to erase. The next vault opens soon.